Let me first introduce our speaker, Professor Michael Weber. And the paper, let me introduce Professor Michael Weber. He is an associate professor of economics at the University of Chicago. He also serves as a research fellow or academic consultant for various research institutions and central banks. His research area includes asset pricing, the macroeconomics, international finance, and household finance, and has publication in leading journals in the area. He is well known for a series of works that uncovers the nature of inflation expectations. So today he will make a presentation on one of these works titled "The Expected, Perceived, and Realized Inflation of U.S. Households Before and During the COVID-19 Pandemic." And we have a discussant, Dr. Meredith Beechey Österholm. Am I correct in pronouncing your name? Okay, thank you. And she is deputy head of economic research department of Reserve Bank of Australia, RBA. And so we'll get started for the session. Professor Weber, please come to the podium.
Thank you so much for having included our paper in the program. It's a great pleasure and honor being able to tell you a little bit about some of the ongoing work we've been doing, trying to understand inflation expectations with mainly a focus on US households, but I come back at the very end of the talk today to also talk a little bit about Japanese households inflation expectations. Lots of the work I'm talking about today is with Olivier Kolbion, Yuri Gornichenko, about a specific paper that the chairman was alluding to, but given the discussion we already had this morning a little bit about the anchoring of inflation expectations and more general patterns, also the role of monetary policy communication as highlighted by Governor Ueda. I actually want to come back to a few of the things that some of our past work, mainly with Oli and Yuri, but also with Francesco D'Acunto and Ulrike Malmentier, have actually uncovered in that very domain. And so motivated a little bit already by the introductory remarks this morning, like when we actually think back 3 years from today, we are kind of facing the onset of the pandemic. We saw a sharp economic contraction, and not only policymakers were struggling, also we as academics were struggling, trying to figure out why is this contraction now triggered by a supply shock or maybe partially demand shock, or how much of the two we could potentially attribute. But even in our shoes of consumers, we were kind of facing similar kind of struggles. So in Chicago, I live on top of a supermarket, a Mariano's, and then I remember going down in early March of 2020, and then you saw at some point shelves being empty, and then I was facing the struggle to figure out, is it the case that the toilet paper has disappeared from shelves due to I and my fellow kind of Chicagoans panicking and stockpiling toilet paper, in which case I might just actually have to be patient, wait for a few weeks until actually kind of shelves are restocked. So more demand shock, or it was potentially due to the fact that, the disruption in supply chains shut down the factories, and ultimately major kind of contraction in supply of basic goods, in which case, of course, then maybe those shortages could be longer lived. And so what we want to do in this paper that I'm talking about today, actually we want to use through the lens of household subjective expectations and their co-movement actually insights to potentially help us understand and disentangle whether kind of through the lens of consumers, this pandemic was supply or demand driven, because of course the importance, as Governor Ueda was highlighting, ultimately this shapes our policy response. Now, what I'll show you in a little bit is that, already as April 2020, you see this huge increase in consumers' inflation expectations, which could be, of course, consistent with the supply shock, but, similar to many economists and then potentially also central bankers at the time, there was huge disagreement also in the inflationary outlook of consumers. And so then, of course, like, we have to understand what drove this disagreement, because potentially this disagreement could be driven by a differential interpretation of the shock, supply versus demand, or it could be driven by like a different severity of the shock as perceived by consumers. And if it's the latter, we want to understand whether this comes from potentially differences in inflation experienced because of we differ in our consumption bundle, or because once we actually fix our consumption bundle, we just potentially pay differential prices conditional on our consumption bundles. So the way we actually try to tackle this question is through like repeated large-scale surveys of US consumers. So like, we can think about it like with typically between 20 and 25,000 consumers that we survey each quarter, starting in 2018 and still ongoing. And the nice feature of this survey that we run on the Nielsen HomeScan panel is that for all of these consumers, you can actually observe at the individual level what they consume, the prices they pay, where they go shopping, whether they use discounts, coupons, and so on. So therefore, like this merged data that then allows us to actually construct at the individual level, realized, perceived, and expected, where the latter two are elicited via our survey, measures of inflation. And then potentially, I also want to talk about the co-movement with other expectations, because with that, if I update upwards my inflation expectations and downwards my unemployment expectations versus upwards my unemployment expectations, that ultimately might help us understand the nature of the shock as interpreted by consumers. And as I was alluding to, like, we saw like huge increases in realized inflation of many commonly purchased goods of consumers, like milk, beer, and so on, but also actually quite a bit of dispersion in realized inflation across households. And like if you do like a little bit of an accounting decomposition, you see like both matter, differences in bundles and differences in price trends, conditional on goods purchased. But it's actually about like 2/3 coming from differences in consumption bundles and only about 1/3 coming from differences in prices paid. And then I show you that like this increase in realized inflation at the household level then maps and transmits one-to-one into like increases in overall US inflation expectations. And then I show you a little bit heterogeneity across different demographics. And here you actually tend to see that lower income, lower education, and Black relative to white households in the US experienced higher inflation during the pandemic. And this then also maps into higher inflation expectations. And like, consistent with some other work documenting unconditionally that many households tend to have a supply side view of the economy, meaning when they expect higher inflation, they also expect higher unemployment. You also do see during the pandemic, those households that update upwards their inflation expectations are also the ones updating upwards their unemployment expectations. So the bottom line is that, the increase in the dispersion of realized inflation is then ultimately likely the driver of the increase in realized dispersion in inflation expectations. Now I want to briefly step back for a second from this specific paper and just talk a little bit about some of the other work we've been doing in this domain, just to motivate why actually looking potentially at realized inflation at the household level could be a fruitful avenue to understanding inflation expectations for the overall US economy in our case, and then also shed a little bit of light on like how central banks potentially should communicate given some of the work we've been doing in this area. So like this morning, we've already kind of discussed a little bit the extent to which inflation expectations are well anchored. And then of course, like as we discussed, like we have to figure out whose inflation expectations we should care about: financial markets expectations, firms, households. At least when it comes to households, I think, and this is echoing a little bit what Maury said previously, this idea that household inflation expectations are well anchored, we potentially have to revisit. And so like, this was our attempt in a recent paper with Kobyo and Gorodnichenko to get an idea whether people have well anchored inflation expectations. Now, of course, like asking people what an inflation target is might be too very hard for ordinary Americans to understand. So our attempt to elicit an inflation target was to say, there's this institution that's in charge of setting the basic level of interest rates, the Federal Reserve. What do you think is the inflation rate the Federal Reserve tries to achieve over longer periods of time? And you do see like, there is a subset of the population, maybe around 20%, that has an idea what an inflation target is. And in fact, actually, potentially also mentions a number that is actually right on point. But you also see that there's a big chunk of a population of 25,000 Americans that, at least based on the observables, are as representative of the overall population as it gets, that actually answer the number larger than 10 percentage points that we bunch together here in a single bin. Now, of course, you could say, well, maybe people don't understand this question. There's lots of noise. People don't have incentive to answer. So I want to also show you a little bit, however, that there are systematic patterns that can help us understand differences in inflation expectations by demographic groups and the signals people observed, which kind of, I think, in our interpretation rules out that, it's just random noise. We don't have to worry about that. And so here, this goes back to kind of a long-standing kind of, we'll call it maybe puzzle for households' inflation expectations, going back to Jonung, using the data for Swedish households in 81. And he documented ex ante, unconditionally, everyone has upward biased inflation expectations relative to exposed outcomes. But this upward bias, in fact, is actually higher for women relative to men. Now, of course, men and women differ along many dimensions potentially. Ex ante, it's unclear why inflation expectations should be one of these dimensions. And so what it did in some work with Lacunto and Malmentier is in actually a customized survey, also on this Nielsen home scan panel that I use for today's paper. We actually asked people, what do you think will inflation be for the overall US economy over the next 12 months? But the nice feature of this Nielsen panel is that you can actually survey male and female household heads from the same household. Typically you look at male and females from different households, lots of things differ, family structure, mortgage choices, and so on. Here we can keep all of that constant and just exploit variation across genders, across female and male households set within the same survey. And here we plot simply in the left panel the average difference in 1 year ahead inflation expectations, even within households. In a single shot survey in June of 2016, women on average expected a 0.4 percentage point higher realized expected inflation over the next 12 months. But then actually, if you just simply separate households in this survey into households where the male household head declares to never go grocery shopping, what we allude to maybe as more traditional households, versus households where the male household head declares to at least once in a while to go grocery shopping. That's the far right panel. What you see here is this unconditional difference actually increases by 40% to around 0.75 percentage points in traditional households, whereas actually in more gender duty equal households, this difference completely disappears because women also have higher inflation expectations. And so to think back a little bit maybe of your basic macro classes in the PhD in the Lucas Island model, there he tells you we are sitting on our own island, we see SIG prices on our island and use them as signal for our overall price. Similarly, households seem to use their shopping trips as their own shopping islands, gather signals when shopping, and then use those signals to form inflation expectations. And this is something we actually just simply ask them, there are different information sources you could use to form overall inflation expectations. What are your top 3 choices? Most important one, score of 3, and so on. And you see, in this survey, 50,000 Americans at least, that own shopping experiences seem by far the most important source of information when it comes to actually inflation expectations, rather than maybe speeches by Chairman Powell or the coverage of those in the media. And in fact, actually then, remember, we said, this Nielsen home scan panel, in fact, allows us to measure realized inflation at the household level. You do actually see that realized inflation, do what the Bureau of Labor Statistics is doing with 2 twists, condition household-specific bundles and household-specific prices, and then sort households based on realized inflation in the last 12 months, and collapse the data by those bins based on what they expect for overall inflation over the next 12 months. And you do see that, those households with the lowest realized inflation in the far left expect substantially lower 1 year ahead overall US CPI inflation relative to households in the right. And actually, you could say, well, maybe they're just forecasting their own inflation. If you were to depict own realized inflation on the y-axis, you would actually see no difference, because many of these price changes in the grocery domain are highly mean reverting. And in fact, like, past household specific realized inflation does not have predictive power for overall US CPI inflation. Now, maybe like if you now think about like what does it mean for monetary policy making, not only do households actually tend to focus on like fast moving consumer goods, things can potentially be even worse if you actually ask them like, are there any specific goods that actually you had in mind when you answered our questions for inflation expectations earlier? People actually tend to mention stuff that, you would say have a tiny expenditure share for most households. Nevertheless, households seem to focus on, for example, like, people tend to mention the price of milk, gasoline, bread. Like this was a survey in the US. If it was in Germany, beer would be more important. In Italy, it's the price of the espresso. In France, maybe it's the price of the baguette. I think also in the UK, it's like the price of milk. There was an FT article about that in the summer of last year. So like, people tend to have an idea what a good should cost, and then they look at what the current price is, and they actually say, well, look, inflation must be really, really high. And so like, maybe this can help us understand an upward bias in inflation expectations. That's in fact actually what you see in the data. If you ask people, think about the price of milk you typically purchase. What is the price of this milk right now? They know exactly what the current price is. If you ask them, what is the price of that milk 12 months ago? And then, we see what they paid based on this home scan data. This is a substantial downward bias in the perception of past prices, which of course on the flip side means you have upward bias perception of perceived milk price changes. What I show you here is that those households that perceive the highest increase in the type of milk they typically purchase over the last 12 months, those are the very households that also have the highest overall US CPI inflation expectations. And now, given that, we discussed monetary policy communication this morning, I briefly changed my slides a little bit. This is from some work where we cooperate with the Bank of Finland and Marita Palovita from the Bank of Finland, where we kind of try to understand whether, kind of complexity of policy communication matters for its effectiveness. And so like Finland, we can observe like at the individual level, many kind of household characteristics. And here I zoom into one peculiar one from the military, a proxy for cognitive abilities. Bottom left, men in Finland with the lowest measured IQ, as at least proxied by the military. Bottom right, highest measured IQ. And then on the y-axis, what you see is like the mean absolute forecast error for inflation in Finland. And here you do see that there is substantial heterogeneity in the ability to forecast inflation based on measures of cognitive abilities. And then in some follow-up work, we actually document that it's really crucial how which policy message you use to reach the overall population using simple policies like, what we call like unconventional fiscal policies, like partially also exploited in Japan in the past. So pre-announcements of future consumption tax increase that are easy to understand, actionable, and to digest by households. They are very effective, at least in Germany, in the top left panel to move inflation expectations before the increase in inflation is operative, and also realize durable purchases in the bottom left panel. Instead, like if you look at announcements by former ECB President Mario Draghi in the right panel, where he explicitly used forward guidance for the first time in July of 2013 and reiterated in January of 2014. Here you do not see either an impact or with a delay that inflation expectations moved in the top panel, nor their durable consumption purchases. So like policies that at least theoretically through the lens of the new Keynesian model would operate exactly identically. Stuff happens in the future, should raise inflation. Today we update our inflation expectations and we go out and consume more. Simple messages like what Angela Merkel said when she actually became chancellor. In 14 months time, we increase consumption taxes by 3 percentage points. They work actually beautifully, at least in these episodes, versus we keep interest rates or current at lower level for an extended period of time, do not have seemed to reach consumers. And this is also something which we actually then show with Olli and Yuri, that actually not only does the message matters, also like the the medium via which you transmit this message matters. Like at least in a US setting, you tend to see that traditional print media is less effective in reaching households through an information provision experiment, because households in the US consider traditional media not trustworthy. So ex ante, you saw everyone has upward biased expectations. To the extent you reach them, as we do in our experiment, they move the expectations in the correct direction, but actually they move by less if you actually have them read a newspaper article relative to an official FOMC statement. And of course, like, the newspaper article is way simpler, but households said, well, look, we don't trust the source. We just actually don't consider newspapers relevant for news about the macroeconomy. Nevertheless, like, you did see that those consumer expectations were widely dispersed. And so here we can directly show that, once you actually look at the exogenous variation induced by our information provision experiments, they do make use of their expectations in a meaningful way, in the sense that those that have exogenously higher inflation expectations, as induced by our information provision experiments, they are the ones actually then subsequently, both via follow-up surveys and in realized scanner data, go out and consume more in line with like a consumer Euler equation. And so like, let me kind of now here, however, zoom into now the specifics of like the talk today. And so like, what I want to do now is actually tell you a little bit how we create realized inflation at the household level. As I already mentioned, this is this Nielsen home scan panel. So like for a panel of 60 to 80,000 households, we observe all their demographics, but crucially also like what they purchase and the prices they pay. And then at some point in 2015, we had actually figured out that we can actually run our own customized surveys on that very panel. And since 2018, we actually survey these households on a quarterly frequency. The nice feature of this survey, not only do you observe what they purchase and prices they pay, it's also such a huge cross-section. Typically, we have between 20 and 25,000 consumers, which of course then allows us to oftentimes also field information provision experiments and actually study many, many different information treatments within the same survey. Now, how do we measure realized inflation at the household level? Like, kind of the type of setting we have, it's pretty much everything that has a barcode that we observe. So for the average household, it's about 25% of the overall consumption bundle. It's stuff we purchase most frequently, most salient, but like big chunks like rent and things like that, that's not part in our data. And then what we do is like, at the quarterly frequency, at the product module level, think about like breakfast bars, baking soda, and so on. We create measures of effective prices, like price paid divided by volume. And then like we look at the realized inflation at the module level, just simply like effective price this quarter divided by log effective price next quarter times 100. And the reason why we do it this way, and this is actually crucial during a pandemic time period, we actually then allow for item substitution, like, think about different types of milk from one type to another, but also for substitution across different stores. Think about you normally go shopping at Whole Foods, and then you trade down to Aldi. These type of margins are really important. That's why we look at effective prices, and we look at kind of a product module rather than barcode level goods. So like, think all type of milk rather than comparing two specific type of milks. And then we create realized inflation at the household level. It's just simply like, the expenditure share weighted average, log price, effective price changes from quarter to quarter. And when we talk about expenditure shares, we look at the average of the bundle last quarter and the current quarter, again, to actually allow for substitution and stock outs. Now, we directly elicit inflation expectations, as the New York Fed has been telling us we should do, like via directly talking about inflation after introducing the concept for inflation. And we do so by eliciting a point estimate and a probability distribution. And so now I want to first show you a little bit of like, patterns in realized inflation across different subgroups over time around the onset of the pandemic. And we do know from some previous work, for example, Kaplan, Schulhofer, Wohl, that there's huge dispersion in realized inflation, but observable household sociodemographics normally have a very little explanatory power. And I show you now actually things differ quite a bit in bad times, or like at the onset of the pandemic. So here I now look at realized inflation quarter to quarter. If you want to have annual numbers, multiply by 4, first by race. And you do see, like before the pandemic, there's no noticeable difference by racial subcategories in the US. But then the pandemic hit, and you see like directly in Q2 of 2020, there's a big spike in realized inflation for everyone. But actually, if you look at the difference, let's say the blue line for white Americans and the dashed black line for black Americans, there's about a 0.5 percentage point difference, meaning like in annualized terms, that's a 2 percentage point difference in realized inflation by race during that period. Even larger differences by income. Lowest income Americans had a higher realized inflation annualized of 4 percentage points relative to high income Americans. And somewhat a similar effect and heterogeneity by education, in the sense that lower educated Americans, higher realized inflation at the onset of the pandemic. Now what I want to briefly kind of figure out graphically, we do it more formally in the paper, is what drives this increase in the dispersion. And so like, I show you here is like, if you look at the percentiles of realized inflation, and you do see like, early on in the pandemic, you've seen increase in the dispersion in realized inflation kicking in, already documenting us that, it potentially is really important to actually zoom into the data and figure out what's going on. And then here I just show you some kind of commonly purchased goods by many households. For example, if you look at eggs or cereal, like, early on in the pandemic, you already saw like egg prices increasing by 12% in our data, whereas like other goods kind of like, even saw mild deflation. So you do see like, big differences in price pattern for commonly purchased goods. Whereas actually, like if you now zoom in, like within product group across household dispersion, there has been a little bit of a trend consistent with, for example, what Neyman and Wafra has been showing. But actually, like you don't see that early on in the pandemic, a big spike. So like, if you do that formally, we show in the paper that about 2/3 of the increase in realized inflation dispersion is due to differences in bundles, and only about 1/3 due to differences in prices paid. And now what I want to actually then show, also during the pandemic, there's this tight link between differences in realized inflation and inflation expectations. So here I just first show you the time trends in the left y-axis for expected inflation, in the right y-axis for the cross-section standard deviation. I do see before the pandemic, both of them somewhat trending downwards. But then actually the pandemic hit, immediately both actually spike up, come down slightly again. In the summer of 2021, you do see that 1 year ahead inflation expectations go up to 6 percentage points already. Of course, very different to, for example, what many economists, including me, were predicting at that time. And so here it's just a scatter plot on the x-axis of realized inflation and the y-axis of expected inflation. So indeed, like you do see this tight link, but maybe actually not as tight as you might have guessed. But recall that, here we only have about 25% of the overall consumption bundle. Many other things actually we don't observe. In addition, maybe here we weigh price changes by expenditure shares, as we argue earlier, like, people oftentimes even focus in on specific individual goods. And so therefore, like what we also want to capture, what we elicit in the survey is like the perception of consumers for what has happened over the last 12 months to inflation, and see whether, this captures an additional aspects of realized inflation that purely in the Nielsen data we might not be able to capture. And kind of here you see, like, if you look at kind of pre-COVID or in red during the COVID period, there's always this very tight link in between what people think has happened to inflation over the last 12 months. This is on the x-axis, and what they expect to happen to overall US inflation on the y-axis. So like, if you somehow have now like, price increases in salient categories for consumers that trigger upwards their perception of inflation, you should be really concerned, because this will transmit one for one into the inflationary outlook. And so like, given that we saw earlier, like there are salient goods like eggs, milk, and so on, those type of price increases can immediately trigger inflationary expectation spirals. And so like the last part of today to kind of close the loop to how do consumers interpret like the increase in inflation early in the pandemic. We now want to kind of like understand how people relate their inflation expectations to their unemployment expectations to understand whether they have a more supply or demand side view of inflation. And so like we do know from some previous work, for example, like Rupal Khamda, that in normal times, there's more supply side view that is prevalent among consumers. And so like here I first show you the expected unemployment rate as elicited in our survey. But here, like, what you now see here is this, how people associate what do you think will happen to the unemployment rate in the US in the next 12 months on the x-axis, and what do you think will happen to inflation in the next 12 months on the y-axis. Again, the same separation in black pre-pandemic, in red during the COVID period. And here you see, like, there's this upward sloping association that those that actually expect higher unemployment are also those that tend to expect higher inflation. And this association tends to be actually pretty similar, and if anything is more pronounced even during the pandemic time relative to normal time. And of course, like, I don't want to associate at all any causal interpretation here. One thing that gets us potentially a little bit closer to causality is, like, here in this panel, as the name says, it is a panel component. So what I want to do now is, like, exploit variation in unemployment expectations and inflation expectations within individual from the quarter before the pandemic to the first pandemic quarter, to then understand, are those households that update upwards their unemployment expectations also the ones that update upwards their inflation expectations? And that's what I look at the next plot. So here we look at forecast revisions, quarter before the pandemic to first pandemic quarter, x-axis unemployment expectations, y-axis inflation expectations. And here in the bin scatter plot, you do see this tight link that households that updated upwards their unemployment expectations are also the very households that updated upwards their inflation expectations. To then go back, supply or demand, here at least through the lens of our consumer expectation, it seems to be more consistent with the supply side interpretation of US households. Then I promised you, like, I want to show you one plot for Japan. And so this is, like, from a new ongoing survey of inflation expectations with Dakunto that we have been fielding consistently around 47 countries, covering like 90% of world GDP. We got the data last week, Thursday, and I just kind of like quickly went to the data we were collecting for Japan end of April to early May to get an idea, like, what do people in Japan right now think inflation is. And this is consistent to some extent with what the deputy governor mentioned at dinner last night. It's somewhere in between overall food inflation of 8% and Big Mac inflation of 15%. Here you see average perception of inflation is around 12% for Japanese households, 1,000 households that we surveyed about a couple of weeks ago. And, similar to what we have seen for Swedish and American households, even in Japan, there is somewhat of a gender difference in the sense that women perceive even a higher inflation rate relative to men. And so, like, with some kind of overview article where we zoom into more like the aspects of monetary policy communication, how central banks can reach households, like, this JEP article with Dakunto, Kopio, and Gornichenko, which actually summarizes in way more detail some of the aspects I was touching upon today. And so, like, let me conclude here. So, like, bottom line, at least through the lens of household expectations, it appears that, households interpreted the initial shock of the pandemic, at least, as supply side driven. And in general, like, bottom line, when we want to understand consumer expectations, we have to kind of zoom into the signals people see, and not all signals, and not weighted by expenditure shares, but potentially even of individual goods that are salient and important to consumers. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Weber, for a very ambitious and very intensive work, which has many implications for our policy formulation in the future. Before turning to the discussion, let me share with you one episode in a Japanese diet. our former Governor Kuroda was called to the diet session, and I was asked one particular question from opposition parties. Governor Kuroda, are you doing the grocery shopping? That was a question they make. And we are just focusing how the Governor Kuroda answered. He answered, I sometimes do. So let me suggest in your future the work, you can include a question to the governor whether you are doing grocery or not. You may have some interesting outcome out of that.
That's an excellent suggestion. And here I'm actually alluding to Frank. I think I once heard the anecdote that Jean-Claude Trichet at a Christmas party was asked about his inflationary outlook, and he referred to his wife because she's doing the grocery shopping. But I'm not sure whether maybe you can confirm or reject this anecdote I've once heard.
So now let me turn to the discussant. Sorry, your name is too long for me, so let me call you Dr. Beechey. Please make a discussion. Thank you.
It's lovely to be here and to be able to be in this room with sort of distinguished colleagues, but also some mentors and friends who I've met over the years. So I feel very qualified as a woman who also does the shopping to be able to comment upon some of these aspects. But first, I'd like to say, Michael and co-authors are extreme experts on this topic, and they have published a wealth of research. So I do hope that I'll be able to come with some penetrating insights that they have not yet thought of. I'm glad also that you've turned your laser sights to the COVID experience, as it gives us something of a natural experiment in order to test some of these relationships. I'm going to review the main takeaways first, and then ask a few big questions, and then suggest some extensions of the work and perhaps some takeaways for communication. So we had a very just had a very detailed presentation. So just trying to summarize what it is that we learned from this. I think the main takeaways are, first, this is a very strong methodological contribution. The paper uses very rich and data with a rich amount of heterogeneity in it, and it struggles with all of the problems about how to actually get these inflation expectations, sort of the sampling, wording, how you prime people to answer the questions, and the various incentives they have to respond. So it's difficult territory simply to get a meaningful data set together. And it's excellent that questions have been added to this large survey in order to tease out some of the relationships. So what have we learned? What did we learn? So one of the first points is that there is a diversity of experienced or realized inflation. And this dispersion of realized inflation, it grew during the pandemic. And it grew largely because of different consumption bundles between households, not because they're experiencing markedly different prices on a person-to-person basis. But I think one of the most interesting things about this was that some households, when experiencing more inflation than another household, some households, and it turns out to be low-income, low-education households, extrapolate more than others to expected inflation. And I think this has important consequences for how central banks choose to communicate to different audiences. So the next point is that there's a tighter link between the subjective perceived inflation and expected inflation than there was with the realized baskets. And there is a bunch of reasons for this. It cuts across all demographics. And these dispersed perceptions help make sense of the surge in the disagreement in expectations. And I think it's a really nice survey device to be going on these sort of subjective perceived expectations rather than realized. But I think we can do some more work to kind of tease out the relationships there. And then the last big point is that Households seem to have this stagflationary view of the world. More inflation means a weaker economic outlook in their understanding. And I think that's one of the key questions is, does that mean that did households know something? Were they more insightful and knew something about the nature of the shock, about the COVID shock? In fact, this is a feature of the data even before COVID. Or is there something else going on? So I think the big questions which I'm going to talk about today are, what do we really know about how expectations are formed? And here I'm talking about this chain from realized to perceived to expected inflation. Another big question is, why do households link higher inflation with higher unemployment? Why do they have this stagflationary view? Is it this clear-sightedness that the rest of us lack, or are there other explanations? And lastly, what does this mean for monetary policy? And in particular, what does it mean for communication? And are there routes to perhaps dampening some of this sensitivity and extrapolation from realized to perceived and expected inflation? So jumping to the first question, what do we know about how expectations are formed? Well, we received an enormous amount of detail about sort of the relationships, about the kinds of salient prices that the prices that are salient for households to review, that there's the frequency with which they purchase things, they're receiving other kinds of news from family and friends and the media, different cognitive abilities. So there are many good reasons why realized and perceived inflation can differ. But I think in this data set, there is actually there is information which could be used to tease out the relationship a little bit more. So one example is the data set presumably includes what we would call salient prices. This is milk and petrol, and presumably also on a regional level so that you're able to pinpoint the heterogeneous realized prices on these categories for different households. How, in running the regressions for the predictive power of realized versus perceived inflation, if you control for these salient prices, or if you control for the frequency of purchases, does that sort of ameliorate sort of the difference and the correlation onto expected inflation? There's another aspect of the data which could be exploited, and that's measures of uncertainty. So some of the households are asked to give a probability distribution of their inflation expectations, and that gives us very rich information about how uncertain they are about their forecasts. There are also other ways to proxy uncertainty. The number of participants in a survey who give answers rounded to the nearest 5% rather than a precise answer with a decimal place is another indicator of uncertainty that could be exploited. And so why does this matter? Well, there is empirical evidence for the US, clearly for Japan, definitely for Australia, that certain demographics have higher inflation expectations. And Michael gave the example of women having higher inflation expectations than men, and possibly relating that to who does the shopping. So I'd like to refer just to a nice analysis which was done just last year at the Reserve Bank of Australia, using the micro data from a large survey of Australian consumers, inflation expectations of other variables. And in that analysis, the researchers control for uncertainty in the way that I just mentioned. Has the participant answered with a number rounded to 5 as a rough guess, or have they answered with a number which is precise with a decimal place? And when you look at the data again and look at those inflation biases, the respondents who respond with a very precise estimate don't have biased inflation expectations, and the ones that are uncertain have higher ones. And when you look specifically at the interaction with women who give very precise estimates do not exhibit this inflation bias. So the effect of the inflation bias is being mediated by the amount of uncertainty. And given that you have that in the data set, I think that would be useful to be able to explore. Another possible extension is to try to get closer to this identifying, are there some in the set who are forming what we would call close enough to rational expectations, and try to proxy that out. There are no perfect and satisfactory measures of rational expectations out there, unless you believe that the central bank's forecasts are the best. But that would be another way to tease out the sort of different subgroups. So turning to the second question, which is sort of this bigger question about how households view inflation and the state of the economy. I think that one of the most persuasive pieces of evidence in this paper is the chart which shows the correlation between the revision in expected unemployment in the next 12 months and the revision in expected inflation in the next 12 months. I think it's all of the other work in levels is interesting, but I think these revisions are the most persuasive because they difference out a lot of the fixed effects. But the question remains: is this a stagflationary understanding of the economy, sort of for real, or is this being driven by other elements, for example, heuristics or sentiment? So again, on the right-hand side of this chart, this is some data from the same research paper that I just mentioned on Australian data. And each panel shows the joint distribution, shows the sort of effectively the correlation between expectations of inflation on the vertical axes, and then a bunch of other variables measuring sentiment. There's the employment outlook, which is probably the closest thing to unemployment that Michael was presenting. But there's also current financial situations, the economic outlook, and purchasing intention. So there's a very, very clear relationship. So this essentially confirms this sort of supply side view of the world. When inflation is high, things are bad. So what could be going on here, rather than an actual sort of supply side interpretation of the world? This may be simple heuristics going on. Simple heuristics where consumers link together factors that lower their real income, lower anticipated chances of employment and lower nominal incomes combined with higher inflation are effects that together fall into the category of bad for my real purchasing power. We see that in the time series, consumer sentiment and inflation expectations are correlated over time in the US and for many, many other countries. But there's also a cross-sectional aspect to this. So the correlation may well be mediated by heterogeneous personality traits in the cross-section. You've got optimists and pessimists, or catastrophizers, as we might call them. If I think that inflation is rising, well, I may as well also think that unemployment is high as well. And the distribution, and I think this might be getting closer to one of the answers, because one of the results that Michael showed us was that this relationship between expected inflation and unemployment holds in the cross-section across all demographic groups, all education groups, all income groups, all age groups. One thing which continues to vary in those groups is personality traits. So it could be this common underlying personality trait factor which is driving and is present in each of those groups. And another possible interpretation is that households, they focus on the risks. Why would they focus on the risks? Well, perhaps they're very, very insightful. They realize that the central bank can offset demand shocks. And so perhaps what's left then is to focus on the supply shocks. So what does this mean for central banks? Well, it means a few things. And I know that Michael and his colleagues actually sort of already started writing papers about this. But the first obvious thing is that central banks need to take household inflation expectations seriously. I notice a tendency where central banks will look at the household expectations. They're a bit crazy, and so we sort of ignore them and say, oh, well, let's look at the inflation swaps instead. That's not the way to go. We need to take them seriously. Particularly seeing as relative price changes, if this is true, relative price changes in fairly narrow bands of goods can spark inflationary spirals if they are concentrated to salient goods or the goods which are purchased frequently. And this comes to, I think, Bernanke and Blanchard have a very recent paper where they talk about attribute much of the rise in inflation early in the pandemic to the impulse which came through product markets, a relatively narrow set of markets. And so these matter for generating inflationary impulses. And of course, then it comes to communication. Should central banks be intervening, and can central banks be pursuing interventions that weaken these linkages from realized and perceived to expected inflation, where there is some extrapolation going on, and also trying to perhaps mediate or inform the linkages between expected inflation and expected unemployment? I think the answer is yes, and this is perhaps sort of the next layer of sophistication of what central banks will be doing in their communication. So what does it mean for policy communication? Well, the obvious one is that policy communication should be accessible. It should meet people where they are. And many central banks have realized this. The Bank of England, the Riksbank have been absolutely layering communication in a way and pursuing many, many more channels. Sort of our communication should be as good as ChatGPT's. If you open up ChatGPT and explain the economy to me from at the moment for the perspective of a 12-year-old or the perspective of a blue-collar worker or the perspective of a financial analyst, it can do it in a second, and we should be able to layer in that way as well. We should also be explaining why things happen and understanding. When people understand why things are happening, they're able to transfer that knowledge to the next episode, to the extent that the next episode contains common features of the current one. And I would say that just reinforcing the inflation target is not enough, because the reason we think that inflation expectations matter is because we think they affect economic decision-making. Helping people understand why a surge in inflation will not lead to a weaker employment outlook is crucial for influencing their economic decisions. Just reinforcing and reiterating the inflation target is not enough. And the last thing I would say is that central banks need to get good at being straight about bad news. And this is something that I think we collectively avoid. Being straight about bad news when a nasty shock is hit and that there will be a deterioration in labour market conditions or the economic outlook, and there will be higher inflation, there will be stagflationary conditions. Being upfront about that can help inform realistic expectations and moderate those unrealistic expectations which can easily extrapolate from the situation. It also builds trust and credibility when the central bank is talking straight, in a sense. And I think the closest parallel is that when the surgeon who is considering how to give the patient the bad news, do I give the patient the sugar-coated bad news or do I give them the straight bad news? And if you give them the straight bad news, then they can take actions which are proportionate to the nature of the bad news and not fly off into catastrophizing and inappropriate actions. The parallel here being economic decision-making. So I think if we're able to get these things right, we might be able to ameliorate some of the communication risks from households who have these types of heuristics. So last but not least, what next? Well, after 30 years of inflation targeting, it turns out that we still have a lot to learn. Keep the survey questions. I can see that there is a feverish activity in sort of creating surveys in all kinds of nations, all kinds of countries and all kinds of groups. So I think proceeding on that line of work is to be applauded. I think we also need to develop theoretical models getting from these realized to perceived to expected inflation. We've got good empirical evidence. I made a bunch of sort of informed guesses, but really kind of pinning that down theoretically I think would be a help. We need to understand what's happening amongst firms, particularly seeing as they are key decision makers in the economy. And last but not least, we need to really understand how inflation expectations affect economic decision making so that we as central bankers understand why we're following inflation expectations and how we can shape our communications. But I suspect that you have all of these questions on your radar already. But I hope that they give you even more conviction to work on them. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Beechey. So let me turn to Dr. Weaver. Maybe thank you for the very, very stimulating discussion. And there are many points. So please, because of the time constraint, pick up a few points that you would like to respond. Well, he's respond. Oh, already the name flag there.
Thanks a lot, Meredith, for a fantastic and a very insightful discussion. I'm also German, so I also, always care a lot about being on time. So let me be brief here. So, just 2 points I briefly want to allude to. So, I'm really, totally with you in, what can potentially drive, what we call now a supply side view of the economy. One of which, allude to potentially personality traits. So, here, I want to just briefly come back to our journey to Finland. But in fact, in some ongoing work with Marita Palovita, who's an economist there, we use the personality traits data of the military. And at least, unfortunately, we only have it for the male population. You do see, for example, men in Finland that score high on hypochondria. They are the ones that actually have the highest increase in inflation early on the pandemic. That's indeed totally consistent with what you are saying. And in terms of how central banks should communicate, so here we kind of misused maybe the official Twitter account of Governor Olli Rehn to identify messages that resemble target communication, where we just say, well, what we do as a central bank, we want to make sure that people don't suffer from the pandemic, versus specific instrument communication like the PEPP. And you do see indeed, and again, so here I can only talk for evidence from households in Finland together with Marita. So you do see that, when you talk about what you aim to achieve, households are very responsive. If you use technical jargons, you're kind of losing them. They don't react to it at all. Indeed, in line with what you were alluding to.
Thank you. So we still have 10 minutes. So let me pick up some of the questions around the table. Following the Chang Yon's good practice, I take the question 2 by 2. So let me prioritize who has a question for the first time. So I'm very confused whether he is a doctor or a professor or governor. So let me call that Mr. with your permission. So I have a Mr. Artig, and then let's say Mr. Chanel, the first two.
Well, thank you, and interesting work as always. About this distinction between the expectations of men and women. So you may have heard me make this comment before. In early 2000s, we at the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland, my colleague Mike Bryan ran a survey based upon the same sort of questions from the Michigan survey, which are still in the New York survey, and discovered this same anomaly about male versus female expectations. We looked at that and followed up with a different question in a subsequent survey that went along the following lines. Do you know what the consumer price index is? And about 3/4 of men said yes, about 2/3 of women said yes. And conditional on saying yes, we asked, do you know how much it grew in the last 12 months? Their answers were remarkably correct. And there was no distinction whatsoever between the responses of men and women. So I think your paper with Raphael this afternoon may kind of get to this point, but my comment really is, I think we have to be a little bit careful about the responses from these surveys and the mapping of those responses to the aggregate objects that really are about our communication strategies within central banks.
Yeah, so I think the gender question is just really fascinating, and I think there's a lot to learn, and you have really great material in your work, Michael. And so you place this as who owns sort of the shopping experience is a key factor here, and I think that makes a lot of sense. I think given the data you have, maybe you could also bring this, and this is a little bit aligned with David's comment, into the COVID period, because the COVID period is in some sense a natural experiment where we couldn't go shopping, or we went shopping very infrequently, and we might have gone shopping online. So maybe there's more of a division of who does the shopping. And this is sort of a treatment. So do you see like some effects along your data? And is there diminishing effect? So that I think we could learn a lot from your interesting data there.
Okay, so first of all, thanks a lot for the great question. So Dave, I'm totally aware of this work, and I'm with you that, once you condition on people that know what the CPI is, and then you zoom into like effectively like, maybe a little bit heretic spoken now, if you zoom into people that know what you aim to elicit, you find that they know that they aim to elicit that. So like what we say, well, we zoom into like a representative population of 25,000 Americans, and we at least want to make sure we tell everyone what we want to elicit, where we say like, what we want to do in the next couple of questions, get your opinion about the concept of inflation. Inflation is the increase in the overall level of prices, and typically measured by the consumer price index. So at least like we are all on the same page. And then I think it came up earlier, like, you do see that women are more likely to round, they have more extreme answers. And so like, I think once you condition on all of those things, then the gender difference completely disappears. Like what we argue is like the reason why women are more likely to be uncertain, why they are more likely to have extreme answers, is because they see very wild swings in individual prices, like the price of milk early in the pandemic and so on. So like, given that we can observe the signals they see, we can actually partially make sense of why you have this long right tail in individuals' expectations. If you say like, the only aim I want to do with household surveys is kind of get the best predictor of like future inflation, then like I'm with you, say like, let's actually only use people that know what inflation is for forecasting purposes. But then potentially, like, you could risk as a central bank to lose trust and credibility by a big chunk of the population, because people, if they think like, as we now see that inflation is 15%, whereas maybe it's high but way lower, and you keep saying, well, we don't really have to take that too seriously. I think it's at some point, if you have again a populist president in the U.S. in the future, a populist has an easy kind of target at an independent central bank that has lost its trust and credibility of the population. But it's maybe like, a little bit going too far now, but I think that's the way I would personally think about it. Raphael, I'm totally with you actually. Like, I think in the conclusion of our proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences paper, we exactly write that. So like, maybe like the kind of pandemic is a great equalizer in the sense that, you do shopping online now, and I don't have to go shopping in the store. Maybe now women and men are doing that more equally. Now, we haven't looked into that. I definitely think this would be super, super interesting. Like what we also allude to, however, in that context is like, given that grocery shopping, at least like in normal times, and like in this work with Olli and Yuri, indicates that people have higher inflation expectations, you might actually make households worse off if you, without now, and this was one of the proposals Meredith was doing, like kind of educating people, if they keep forming their expectations as they normally do, and now you force men to also go grocery shopping, they have higher inflation expectations, and then you might potentially make the household worse off. So I'm not proposing a kind of sticking to traditional gender norms, but I think the first thing, answer then should be what Meredith was alluding to kind of investing in outreach, communication, and explanation, partially what the Cleveland Fed has been doing through informational videos. But I think the biggest challenge, nevertheless, is for central banks finding creative means of communication for reaching households, because at least most of the time, if people still read newspapers, they don't read the part about monetary policy.
Okay, thank you. We still have 7 flags, but lunchtime is approaching, and I don't like to sacrifice too much lunchtime. Let me take just 3 more questions from the floor who didn't make a question in the last session. So first, Mr. Shoji, and then Mr. Len, and then Ms. Unge, please.
Okay, thank you very much for the very exciting presentation. 2 questions and 1 quick comment. First, do the households respond to news about the prices of goods that they purchase frequently? Like, for example, if they hear about the OPEC reducing their production and the WTI is skyrocketing? Do they respond to that, or do they wait until they actually see gasoline prices going up to respond? So that's question number one. Question number two, do you see any differences with respect to age? Because especially in countries like Japan, old people, there are more old people and they vote more often, so they have more political power. Finally, a very quick observation. You showed us the Japanese data, and I was struck by the lack of gender gap among the Japanese households, because I think Japanese men are known to not do grocery shopping. Thank you.
Mr. Len, please. Mr. Len, please.
Thank you very much, and many thanks to Michael and Meredith for excellent presentation and discussion. One comment and one question. I think as regards your research on communication, Michael, I can only confirm what you said about the effect of communication on expectations between focusing on objectives on one hand or instruments on the other hand. Our conclusion from your research has been basically to follow the footsteps of Bank of England and Riksbanken, that it's important to do layered communication, and it's important to keep it simple and speak about sustainable growth, full employment, purchasing power, recovering purchasing power, and not so much about QE, QT, APP, PEP, negative interest rates, and so on and so forth. And on the lighter side of life, maybe on the basis of your data, where I may have been as an anonymous individual, as a reserve officer, so maybe I should also personally lower my inflation expectations in the medium term in order to increase my IQ, to do some reverse engineering. My question is about institutions. I think they also do matter, and my question is, have you studied the formation of inflationary expectations in different institutional contexts? For instance, if you take the Eurozone, you have a usually quite important role for social partners, including trade unions. And as Michael, you know well, the German case, you can see that IG Metall, the metal workers union, has struck a deal for this year, next year, where they assume declining inflation. So how would you interpret that in light of your studies?
Then Ms. Bunge, please.
Yes, thank you. And it's a very interesting discussion about grocery shopping. And I think there are benefits for men and women doing grocery shopping other than monetary policy. But I think this is a really interesting thinking about the period post-COVID, since we saw the first supply shock coming into both groceries, but then also energy prices, which would, of course, make men using their cars also feel the same rising inflation. But in Sweden, I would say that we saw this later, of course, than in the U.S. But when it came, we could also see that firms changing their behavior was quite significant. And we asked the questions to Swedish firms about raising prices, and in the fall of 2021, they said that it was impossible to raise prices, whereas in February of 2022, they said it had never been so easy to raise prices. So you could see the effects of rising inflation expectations from the public coming into that. And so I think that Meredith's suggestion of looking into firms' behavior is really interesting also in this context. But when it comes to communication, I think this is one of the challenges that we're now facing, that I think that still the general public see this as a supply-driven inflation. And we are seeing also that we had a very high demand after the pandemic. So I think trying to communicate the long-term costs of letting this high inflation persist is really important, and also in these different channels, as you said. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Professor Weber, please.
Yeah, let me maybe just do the reverse order. So, like, I'm totally with you. I know, like, understanding better, like, firm expectations is actually central. So, like, in some ongoing work with Esther Faya, Francesco da Cunto, and Klaus Adam, what we've been doing is, like, doing, like, one of those information provision experiments on firms in Italy to get an idea, like, when do firms want to increase their prices, and which channel is actually prevalent in the summer of last year. And so, like, totally in line with what you find in kind of Sweden is, like, one of the things we wanted to test is the channel of customer and tokenization. Like, normal times as a firm, I don't want to raise my price because I feel like, a lack of demand, people substituting away. So, like, one of the treatment groups was telling firms, like, what consumers right now expect will happen to inflation, and those that actually then updated upwards their inflation expectations, meaning the firms, because they learned that consumers anyway already expect prices to skyrocket, are also the firms that say, well, now it's actually a good time for us to actually increase prices and to lower the duration of price spells. Indeed, like, in line with kind of what you find, and also kind of models of kind of state contingent pricing. Ollie, like, I'm glad to hear that research informs policy. So, like, that's always fascinating. Now, coming to your question, so, like, I was always kind of interested in better understanding the role of institutions, also collective bargaining. That's also very prevalent in Italy, for example, and then ultimately, like, the role of trade unions' expectations and how they are formed. Like, unfortunately, like, I don't have any kind of research on that yet, so we want to do that partially with this cross-country study. What we did, however, do, and this is Francesco da Cunto just actually kind of sent me an update on the first draft of the paper this morning, is actually, like, we use for, like, a smaller subset of countries, for, like, 20 countries where we have communist and non-communist countries, like, their average inflation expectations after they became no longer communist, so, like, whatever you want to call them now. And so, like, what you see there is, like, households in countries with a communist experience have substantially higher inflation expectations than kind of households in market economies. And the idea there is, like, under communism, prices were stable. Then, like, you move away from communism, you see immediately subsequently huge increases in the price level. The same happened in Eastern Germany after reunification, and that seems to have actually lasted a long-lasting imprint. And so we look a little bit at heterogeneity, kind of trying to pin down exactly this mechanism, but that's why I think institutions are really important. When I definitely want to study the role of unions. Now, regarding, like, the first set of questions, so, like, when you, at least in the US, study kind of the reaction to news, you tend to find that even for some of the kind of largest, most kind of relevant policy changes, most households actually don't directly kind of focus on those news. So, like, Raphael, together with Ollie and Yuri and colleagues at the Cleveland Fed, have this very nice paper where they study, like, around the announcement of AIT in the US. Did people hear about it? Conditional on hearing about it, did they update their expectations? By and large, unfortunately, most households didn't even hear about it, and even those that actually claimed in the survey they heard about it did not actually adjust their expectations in line with moving from IT to AIT. Now, in terms of heterogeneity by age, this is now something we looked at using data from the New York Fed survey. You tend to see that older households tend on average slightly higher inflation expectations. And when you look at the surge of inflation expectations early in the pandemic, it tends to be actually stronger for older relative to younger households. And then, like, regarding the gender gap, I was also surprised, but, given that now we did see also gas prices and other food prices having gone up so much, that might partially kind of explain that. And I have to dig more into the data. The only thing I've done so far, take the raw data, unzip it for Japan, and collapse by gender. So this was raw data evidence without having pinpointed into specific other alternatives. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Weber. And thank you for the discussion, Dr. Beechey. Thank you. Just one suggestion. We have one department store across the street from this building. So that in the basement, they have a grocery shop. So why don't you go to that grocery shops and do some shopping? That's good for your future study and also good for the Japanese economy. Thank you.